hello all and welcome to Pragati Vichar Literature Festival's Authors Marathon. Today's theme for the day is poetry and mythic echoes, and the session name we are having is Where Myths Find Their Voice. Let me introduce you to the wonderful panelists I'm having today. So, first on the panel, we're having Mani Rao, who is author of So That You Know. So, Mani Rao is the author of 12 poetry books, including So That You Know, which has been published by HarperCollins. Her books in translation from Sanskrit include Kalidasa, Selected Poetry and Drama, Bhagavad Gita, and Saundarya Lahari. A translation from Hindi of Anamika's poetry has been published as Slowed Down River. Her research into mantras led to the publication of Living Mantra, Mantra Deities, and Visionary Experience Today. Mani was a writing resident at Iowa International Writing Program, Omi Ladic House, and the International Poetry Studies Institute. Thank you so much, Maniji, for joining us today. I'm looking for a
Thank
wonderful
you. Thank
conversation
you
with
for
you.
having me. Yeah.
Next on the panel, we are having K. Srilata, who is author of Footnotes to the Mahabharata. She is a poet, fiction writer, translator, and academic. Srilata's most recent collection of poems include Footnotes to Mahabharata and Three Women in a Single Room House. Her critically acclaimed books, The Kind of Child, The Disability Story, documents the disability experience. Srilata's other books include five collections of poetry, the anthologies, The Rapids of Great River, The Penguin Book of Tamil Poetry, short fiction from South India. Thank you so much, Srilata ji, for joining us today.
Thank you. My pleasure entirely.
Perfect then. So, without further ado, let's start off with my question answer round. So, my first question to both of you would be: so, both of you draw from timeless narratives, Mani through Sanskrit texts and Srilata through the Mahabharata. So, how do these echoes of the past shape your present poetic voice? So, let's start with Maniji first.
Okay, thank you so much. See, actually, there are two kinds of strands in my work. One is translations of wisdom texts from Sanskrit or classics. And in that, actually, it's the other way around. It's my poetic voice that shapes the translating voice, you know. So, whatever content is being translated, that is obviously seen through the lens of my poetics. The second body of work is my poetry. And in that, whenever I refer to myths or when I write about myths, um, obviously it will be the content. The content of the poetry is the myth, whether it's a fragment or whether it's the entire theme or whether it's a reference. The content is the myth. So the interaction is like sort of weaving in and out. And it doesn't necessarily have to be Indian myths. It could be any myth from anywhere. And I believe we are all heirs to all myths everywhere. It depends on what we want to draw a connection to, what we think is a lineage, you know. For example, I have an entire book called Sing to Me, which is poems based on Greek myths. And in those poems, many references are Indian myths also. So you may have Aphrodite, you may have Kali, you may have different characters appearing depending on what is being discussed. So there may be a broad theme. Uh, I would like to illustrate what I'm saying with an example. I have a poem in So That You Know in this new book called Tiruvannamalai. Tiruvannamalai is a place, as we all may know. Um, and in that, I am referring to, the ocean churning mythology, the myth, the story about the churning the ocean. And I'm talking about the mountain of Tiruvannamalai and how everybody does a pradakshina around it, circumambulates it, you know. So taking that image and making a connection with the ocean churning image. And again, ocean churning is the churning within oneself because you churn within yourself for the rising and the manthana for towards self-realization eventually. So that is the bringing up of all the um, what surfaces. So here's the poem Tiruvannamalai. After I spat out sweet and sour stories under the tamarind tree, old photographs at Ramana's cave looked at me infinitely. Agape, I walked on barefoot, rocks rumbling replies. Arunachala, Red Mountain, your silhouette lines my dreams. Every morning, humanity snakes around you, churning. So you see there the reference is in the last line, but it is almost like the pivot of the entire poem. More generally speaking, to your question about how the echoes of the past shape the present voice, I would say that being aware of so much of the material in the classics and in wisdom texts, it's humbling. One becomes sort of more aware of how minuscule our own knowledge is by comparison to how much was known before and how much was suggested and hinted at. And like for the even if you look at say Kalidasa, the way that he is able to use meter, at the same time keep the story going, at the same time the use of the word seems apt, and he gives us his insights. The way that all of this is done, and this is done in the 4th century, you know just looking at that sheer mastery, it puts us in awe, and we realize that we are a part of a long line and we have so much to learn, so it makes me an eternal student.
Hmm. Really insightful answers from your side. So, Srilata ji, what's your input into this?
Uh, yeah. So, as Mani just said, in my case too, I think I certainly used two very distinct, different poetic voices. One that comes from, I mean, the recent book Footnotes to the Mahabharata. You can see that it's really from the space of mythology. But also, I use a voice in my other work, a voice that's more sort of direct, more personal. That said, though, the past has a way of living on, whether you like it or not. Sometimes, even when you, sort of actively resist it. And I think that as writers, we're all writing from to or about the past, right? And in fact, I would even go so far as saying that all our work is necessarily palimpsest. So my writing overlays other writing from the past, writing by others, and the resonances, the traces of the latter inevitably remain and shape my own writing, right? And I'm not talking here of plagiarism or literary influences or anything like that. So when it comes to literary cultural texts, especially epics such as the Mahabharata, epics from all over, I think the palimpsest is a very useful way of thinking about the work that we do with these epics. Call it retellings, call it. It's almost like a writing over with due respect to the texts that are foundational, right? So we always build on top of existing foundations that for whatever reason, remain deeply resonant, that speak to us from across eras, literally, right? So Wendy Donegal, the scholar, actually points out that the Mahabharata, as an epic, marks the transition from the corpus of Sanskrit texts known as Shruti, which is broadly the Vedic canon of texts, which are sort of unalterable in a sense, and this whole thing of a group of texts which would you could classify under the idea of smriti, which is the human tradition which is constantly revised, the remembered texts of human authorship texts that can be altered in a way, right? So really what I was doing with footnotes to the Mahabharata was to uh, let myself slip into a story or into stories from the past, try on voices, write in the voices of five women in the epic. There is Ali, who comes from the Tamil Dravidian Mahabharata, not very well known outside that landscape. There's, of course, Draupadi, Hidimbi, Gandhari, and Kunti, the other four voices. So, in a very obvious sort of way, you have the past that sort of seeps into my voice, but then mine, of course, is a contemporary voice. And it's really the past taking, if you like, the avatar of the present. There's a collapsing of time periods and so on. So, for instance, the voice of Draupadi's mother, Prishati, Queen Prishati, as she speaks to a young Draupadi, someone who's not yet married, a young girl actually, a young Draupadi who's more interested in reading and writing than in preparing for the life of a married woman, could be the voice of your present day mother, and Draupadi could well be a young woman from today. right? And in fact, as a writer friend of mine, recently said to me, she said that this is exactly what her mother would say to her when she sat down to read or write. Put away your books, put away your pen, right? So really, so let me sort of read you that particular poem I'm just speaking of to illustrate what I'm kind of saying. Um, Put away that parchment, put away your quill. Scriptures and poems are of no use to women. Cast aside your coarse garments, drape yourself in these silks softer than deer skin. Try on these pearls, more lustrous than the moon. Put away that parchment, put away your quill. Mark my words, daughter, you won't go far with this life of the mind. Yeah, so
Hmm. Very great answer indeed. I'm really curious. So you both have written in the poetry books as well, and the drama and the other books as well. So what do you enjoy the most? Like, what do you write? Enjoy the writing the most? So what would be your answer?
Srilata, you first.
I think it's sort of hard to pick because I think depending on what the subject matter is, what it is that I want to write about, there is a particular genre which calls to that subject matter, right? So, for instance, my book about the disability experience, which kind of partly draws on my own experience as a mother and my daughter's experience as a young person living with an invisible learning disability. I have poems about it. Yes, I do. There are like little poems here and there, but I couldn't tell the entirety of the experience through poems. That was somehow not, that just didn't work for me, right? So I had to choose nonfiction. I had to sort of use the autobiographical eye. And so that just came out like that. And I do have a novel, and that could only be written as a novel. And the poems, this, for instance, footnotes to the Mahabharata, so many have asked me, why is it that I chose to chose poetry over prose? Because prose, of course, has a wider readership and there's that whole practical thing. But I think as writers, we don't do the practical very well, So what comes to you in that form, and you just have to do it. And I found that with poetry, I could use the dramatic monologue. I could use a speaking voice. I could have an invisible, a sort of a non-speaking listener, right, who doesn't say much. And all of that. So that worked as a poem for me. And this is really a series of largely dramatic monologues. So, yeah, that's.
I too would echo what Srilata says, that it depends on what the subject is or what the content is. The form is dependent on that. I write prose also. I've written lots of essays, and of course, every book of translation has prefaces, and I have an entire book of research which is prose. But still, I would say poetry is my primary genre. Whether I'm writing poetry or whether I'm translating, I tend to choose texts that are poetry. So if it's the Upanishads, I most probably would choose a poem, an Upanishad which is in the form of a poem. Like, Kalidasa, I mean, he writes plays, but he's really a poet writing plays. Soundarya Lahari is Shankaracharya, but it's a hymn. It's got a meter, it's got all the poetic qualities. Gita also, I mean, everybody thinks of it as a canonical religious text, but really it's a poem as well. It's sung even, it has its the flow, it has imagery. It is a really a very interesting poem with very serious content. So I would say poetry is my primary life breath. It's the main, it's the mainstay, and everything
Hmm.
else support is that supports everything else, or everything else is like on the margins of that, whether it's
Hmm.
translation, whether it's research. Even my research into mantra, that is also linked to poetry, because it's about sound. It's about, how at the most intense the combination of syllables is what the mantras are. So the research into numerous aspects of mantras was actually really a poet's quest.
Hmm. Indeed. So with that, let's move to my next question. So how does poetry help bridge ancient insights with today's concerns like gender, ethics, or resilience. So, Maniji, let's start with you first.
Okay. So, see, the thing is, no matter what literature is being written, it has always got a text, has got a context. And we must never forget that. Sometimes people respond to texts getting very upset about the content of that text, but that reference is most probably to the socio historical context of that text, right? And when we read the text, we have to realize that and place it there. A really good example to understand this is the character of Shakuntala as seen through different works. If you look at the character of Shakuntala in the Mahabharata, she's actually quite feisty. She actually negotiates with Dushyanta about getting the kingdom for her son. She's a very fierce character. She's very independent minded. Then, a few centuries later, or God knows how many centuries later, you come to Shakuntala in Kalidasa, and it's a totally different story. Here, Dushyanta is not like a cad. Here, there's a curse, Durvasa's curse, and he's completely excused from it. He's completely excused from his behavior because of the curse, right? So here it is set in a courtly setting where the audience is kings, and Shakuntala is a woman who doesn't have the same fierce, feisty attitude as she did in the Mahabharata. Same character, different century, different author, different perspective, right? Now, if I were to write something, I would also have concerns that come in from around me. Of course, they're going to come in. So when I write, let's say, a poem about like Helen of Troy, or whether it's Philomela, or whether it's anything, Sita, no matter what the character is, I will be bringing in my own concerns into that. Even in the Gita, although I would say that in translation, I don't think the job of the translation of the translator is to go against the grain. A translation actually reproduces, like, there's the first concern being fidelity, etc. And so there you're not in the business of revising. In fiction, you can retell. In translation, you're representing. So nobody is buying the Kalidasa book because it's not, they're not buying Mani Rao, they're buying Kalidasa by Mani Rao. So I have to represent Kalidasa correctly. So there I would not be bringing in my own concerns too much, except where interpretation goes, inevitably some of those will seep in. Some of those will seep in. So, for example, in Bhagavad Gita, even, see, in all the ancient texts, all the pronouns are male, masculine. It's always saha, 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 saha. Human beings are represented as he, But in my Gita, when I was putting myself in Arjuna's shoes, and that was the whole approach, I converted everything from he to she. So when Krishna is talking about all the qualities of a person, he is always referring to she is, or her. So that's one very small, I would say, liberty that I took with that, because I wanted to write a text that would show that women are very much a part of this audience who's receiving this message. Yeah, but I think so it's different. If you're writing poetry, you are going to have your context and concerns come into play. But if you're doing translation, where that particular point of revision occurs may be different.
Yeah, I agree absolutely. I think Atish has
Have we
gone off.
lost Atishai?
Yeah, looks like. But I think we should go on
But
because
we should go on because it's being
it's
recorded. So yeah.
being important. Yeah. Right. So you're right, I think, Mani, about, when it's a translation, I think the point at which you, or extent to which you revise the text, I mean, you've got to be very, very sensitive to the socio-historical context of the original text. But I think, when it is really not a translation, but a retelling or a rewriting, then you do have a bit more playing room. But I think there's still the question of due respect to the text, and I really sort of believe in it, but also speaking from a different jumping off point, which is that of the present. I think is something that I've done with footnotes to the Mahabharata. So the thing is, I think to sort of respond to the original question itself. So really what we think of as today's concerns were yesterday's concerns as well. I mean, the more I read, the more that becomes obvious to me. When you look at the patterns, you mentioned gender, ethics, resilience, the idea of suffering, a model of spiritual compass, all of this, in a way, maybe so much has changed, but in a sense, not that much has. Yeah. So we still have good times, we still have bad times, just like before. And I think literature, all forms, including poetry, are at some level philosophical meditations via narrative. And good poetry is obviously insightful, right? And so much that is insightful in poetry comes from ideas that have been in circulation for centuries. So, for instance, the Mahabharata central tenet that war is perhaps not such a great idea, or that greed for what is not yours is going to land you in hell. It's going to destroy you. It's going to destroy kinship and families and all of that. Or quite simply, that life is hard. It's very, very hard. And it's hard even for kings and queens and princes and princesses, yeah? And that one must navigate it the best one can. And that often in the process of this navigation, one makes mistakes. The sort of mistake that Draupadi makes when, there's a story of how she insults Karna during her Swayamvara, right? And the decision that Gandhari makes to blindfold herself. All these issues have lifelong consequences for these characters, just like our thoughtless actions in the present might. So when you read a good text, a good poem, you come away enriched, you learn something, you have a sudden understanding, and reading good poetry, reading all good literature, all good texts, is really, it's a series of epiphanic moments, I think, and that's why we turn to literature and to poetry, really.
Just a follow-up question to this would be, since we're drawing so much from our ancient or from our mythological past, how do you research it so well that it remains accurate and actually we depict the meaning what it was meant to be? Maniji, what would be your insight into this question?
It depends on exactly what text you're talking about. If you're talking about something very esoteric, let us say more from the Shastras, it would be more difficult, I would say. You would have to look into what terms mean. You would have to have an understanding of the overall subject. So, I mean, translating Saundarlehari is not just about translating Saundarlehari. You have to sort of be immersed in the overall sadhana, into the overall terminology, into the mindset. So there is a whole world that you have to be a part of in order to feel instinctively or use your gut feel. And of course, where it is ancient texts, most likely there have been previous commentaries, there have been previous translations, so you do rely on them. A lot of times commentaries will be contradicting, there'll be different interpretations of the same thing. So which one do you go with? You have to make that choice. Sometimes old manuscripts will have a word where you can't really tell the letter, and there are options for whether that word is this word or is it this word. So there are judgments you're making at every point of these kind of like critical points. So that is part of the challenge of translating older texts. It's not just about the language, it's about the overall world that it is a part of.
We can't hear you.
So sorry. You're in good, Srilata.
Yeah. So this work is, of course, a little bit different from, I think, the sort of work Mani was talking about. But nevertheless, it did involve. When I started work on this project, and I told myself this is just going to be a huge amount of research, right? And then the more I dipped my feet into what was really this massive version, the more of a fool I felt for actually even taking this on. And it is a real rabbit hole, because where do you begin? There's just so much scholarship that's gone into it, and I cannot claim to be a scholar. I wouldn't claim at all that I'm a scholar of the Mahabharata. I don't know who can, there is no knowing it in its entirety, right? It's not just is it a complex text, just canonically speaking. It's just that there are just so many offshoots. You move 100 kilometers away from one town into the next, and then you hear another version. So we all know that. I think as Indians, we grow up knowing, so for instance, you go outside Tamil Nadu, maybe in Andhra, I don't know, Mani, you might be able to throw some light on it. People may have heard of Ali, the whole concept of Ali Rajam. So Ali is one of Arjuna's lovers, right? And when he comes down south with Krishna, so he sort of conquers Ali, who he seduces her, and there is a version that says he actually rapes her, right? He's sort of sexually assaults her, and so this is only known in the ballad tradition. It's not in the written Tamil the Bharatam either, right? So there's all that. So depending on where you're located geographically, and who tells you the Mahabharata and what sort of exposure you have, it can be a different text altogether, and there are contradictions, there are conflicts, and even if you take the simple Mahabharata, if there is such a thing, it's so intricate in its design, right? So what a character does, in the first parva, will have consequences, several parvas later, and then you have to actually look back and see, okay, what happened then? What did he do? What did she do there? And it isn't, so I think I remember feeling distinctly overwhelmed by this experience. The book was actually, the research was partially supported by a grant from the India Foundation for the Arts. And so I think that sort of added to my guilt, because I felt the weight of that responsibility of like having to do my research, right? But then I also realized halfway, and this is something I did speak to the foundation also about, people from the foundation, that what I wanted to do was really creative retelling. And at some point I had to pick and narrow down, just like you do in research. You have to narrow your focus down, that there's this much, but you can only deal with this. And this is a really slim book. It's just like a tiny little book, and it's not even a tiny little slice of, not even a 1 millionth part of what the Mahabharatas are, right? So I think the moment I let go of that weight of responsibility of having to be this perfect scholar, like knowing it all, like this, whatever, I think then I breathed easy. And then the poems started to come to me as they came. And they came from certain retellings to which I think I've remained respectful of, and I've cited them, not just that, but also, it was a conversation in a sense with those texts. But I think that narrowing down of the material, figuring out who I wanted to write about, which stories of theirs, which moments in their lives, in Hidimbi's life or Draupadi's life, once I figured out what those moments were, and what narratives I wanted to create from that, then I think things fell into place. But until then, there was this massive anxiety of research. Yeah.
Atisha, may I add
Sure.
something to that?
Sure, definitely, ma'am.
So, see, interestingly, with Soundarya, actually, about 2008 or 2009, I had first attempted translating it, and I had only translated about 7 or 8 stanzas, or maybe it was 7 stanzas, where it ends with, may she stand before us, addressing the goddess. I couldn't translate beyond that. I was just unable to. I just thought the whole idea of the goddess manifesting in front of you was just so daunting, and I felt completely like not up to the ability of going further in that. And I completely forgot about that project until years later, after I had, done a PhD in religious studies, I had studied Tantra, I had taken initiation, I had done field work. All of these things, many, many years later, brought me back to Soundarya, and it was in 2020 or 21 during the COVID time. I spent an entire year studying and translating it. So this is actually a book that had a journey of over a decade for me to become capable of feeling that I can translate it. And that is exactly what you're talking about. How do you know what something means? I don't think I would have known in 2008 what I knew in 2018. And that learning was a lot of learning that led to that confidence and ability to do that translation.
Hmm. Perfect. That pretty much answers my question. And now with that, I'll move to the individual question round. So my first question would be to Srilata. So your work also speaks for silenced voices, such as in disability in your narratives. So do you find parallels between reimagining mythic voices and amplifying marginalized ones today?
Yeah, so let me maybe just speak about my one of my more recent books, this kind of child, that the disability story the narrative that you mentioned, right? So in that book, I write about the fact that disability is a no man's land. Mainstream medicine, by its very nature, is focused on what's treatable, fixable, and sort of moment that it's not you're not this is not a fixable body or a fixable mind, or it's a hard to fix body and mind, people lose interest, right? So the whole thing about chronic illnesses, pain, disabilities, which are impossible to treat or fix, they are poorly understood, poorly researched, and all of these experiences, bodily experiences, become really nobody's babies, and they tend to be sort of locked away. I mean, so we create silos, right? We have special schools, we have the private space of the home. They are really experiences nobody wants to talk about. The disabled body or the learning disabled mind is seen inherently as flawed and imperfect. It's a suffering body, a body that we would do anything to avoid, right? So there is also a related realm of experience that remains just as overlooked, and that is the work of caregiving, or looking after or supporting a person with a disability, right? Making the world accessible, making it a little bit easier for them in some ways. And that work, like so much care work, is also, the fact that it is unaccounted for, ties up with the fact that it is, I think, very often women who take on that caregiving, mothers, sometimes even sisters and so on. So there's all of that. So the book kind of talks about some of those issues. But so, yeah, there are all those are marginalized voices in a sense, right? And I also feel that so many stories, so many characters, very often women's characters, but not just women. I mean, there are just so many ways of marginalizing people, and there is not like, okay, this group is marginalized for all time. It's unchangingly marginalized. That's not true either, right? It's kind of a fluid thing, But in the Mahabharata, like what you're right in the sense that what I decided to go with was perhaps what you would call marginalized, though, Draupadi is really not a marginalized character in that sense, right? Some of the things that we should be talking about when we talk about Draupadi is perhaps sort of suppressed or not sort of brought out, right? So I think you could say that I have always been drawn to the perspective of the marginal human, that of the outlier, say somebody like Hidimbi, for instance, or Ali, right? And for me, that's always interesting, the story that doesn't get told, doesn't get sort of placed center stage, right? So what I always ask myself, with any story, real, imagined, mythical, whatever, right? What if those who are not the obvious heroes, not the obvious success stories of this particular text? What if those people were to tell the story? What if those who are overlooked or silenced, or sometimes who silence themselves for various reasons? What if they tell the story? What sort of story would that be? As I said, in the Mahabharata, it is not as though all its women are unimportant to the narrative, right? So that would be, I think, the wrong thing to say. As I said, Draupadi is a catalyst, and she is believed to have created the great, caused the Great War. But then we don't see so many other aspects of her. We don't see who she was before she married the Pandavas, and Ali is not even on the map of the mainstream Sanskrit version. She's part of the Dravidian ballad tradition. Hidimbi is a Rakshasi and remains actually fairly marginal to the story, right? She isn't even seen as a proper woman. Her humanness is in question. So I think that's what I think, really, really captured my interest. And that's where the writing, I think, came from.
Hmm. So my next question would be to Maniji. So your book, so that is a bold and experimental collection. So how do you maintain intensity in this book while keeping the poetry accessible and so that it resonates with the readers?
Very, very interesting question, actually, and something that could be discussed for a long time, but I'll try to be as brief as I can with some guesses. Intensity, I believe, comes from synapses, the spaces between things, and in suggestions, and in something that leads towards an understanding. So it breaks sort of open in the mind of the reader, and the intensity occurs there. If just because you rave and rant doesn't mean something becomes intense. Intensity happens when you can feel that piercing stab, when you can feel that sharp understanding. So that point of intensity can be created through, like, for example, if you have something general, sudden flash insight, that creates intensity, you know, or restraint creates intensity. The density creates intensity, just like a laser beam. It's how condensed it is, how sharp it is. It's all that light put together in that one line. It's concentrated. So that kind of concentrated point creates intensity. As far as accessibility and resonating with the reader, it's shared experience usually that creates that sense of understanding. And if they don't share that experience, it's they pick up on, because we're all human beings, and we all have the same apparatus, same set of senses, and we go through life. There are so many things in common. It is inevitable that there will be resonance. You just have to allow it to happen. So, for example, I'll give you an example with a poem. I have a poem in So That You Know, which is called Pathetic Fallacy. Pathetic fallacy, as you know, is like a term that meaning that, let's say you're crying and you think that it's raining, and it's raining because you're crying. So you attribute the emotion um,
Hmm.
to nature. So the title of this poem is Pathetic Fallacy. It's a poem about aging. It's 3 lines: sunset, sky, youth gone, passion lingers. It's those 3 lines. And so when the reader reads those 3 lines, they're forced to stop. They're forced to pause. It's not a long poem describing the sunset sky and the red color, etc. Nowhere does it say it's red. But the minute you say sunset sky, you have the image in your mind of a reddish sky. And that is the leap to passion. And that passion lingers, but the sun has gone. And likewise, youth has gone, but passion lingers. So that analogy is created purely through suggestion, through brevity, and through a concentrated use of language. So there are no extra words, there's nothing unnecessary in any poem, and that's what makes them intense.
Hmm. Right. So with that, we are at the end of the session. And my last question to both of you would be actually a closing note. So what is your message to the future poets?
I don't have any message for future poets.
Any tip that you like to give them in terms of writing, or any message that you would like to relate to the user or to the viewer as well?
No, I don't think like that. No, I don't have anything at all. Srilata, maybe you do.
Yeah, no, I think, yeah, I mean, it's hard to, because I think the thing is, the writing or being a poet is not a job. Like, there isn't a well laid out path. So that's, I guess, the first thing I would tell them. And the second thing is that you really learn it by doing. You also learn it by reading, I think, and yeah, and I think sometimes you have to recognize and step back from the situation when you know that what you've written down. I mean, you may think it's wonderful that, but you have to. There has to be an honesty in saying, okay, like this perhaps doesn't work. At whatever stage of life you're in. Sometimes you may be what we call, I hate that phrase, but a senior poet, but you may write a really god awful poem. Then you should know that it's a bad poem and you shouldn't be sending it out, or you should do nothing with it and throw it. Right? I guess, yeah, just these very little things, but yeah.
Yeah, perfect then. Thank you so much, Maniji, Srilata ji, for being a part of this festival and
Thank you.
sharing your
Thank you.
valuable insights with us and the user. Yeah. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you to
Thank
PVLF and
you.
to you. Thank you.